Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another special Trip Hacks DC spring live stream. My name is Rob. I'm the founder of Trip Hacks DC, and I am joined today by Carolyn from DC Design Tours to show you some of the blossoms around the National Cathedral. So, today is Sunday, March 28th, 2021 at 11 a.m. And I will go ahead and say hello to Carolyn, who you may remember from a few previous Trip Hacks DC videos, including the sites in Georgetown.
Embassy Row 2.
And if you are interested, Carolyn does have a real-life version of the blossoms in the Cleveland Park neighborhood, which we generally consider the National Cathedral to be a part of. All right, so if you are tuned in, go ahead and let me know where you are tuned in from. Go ahead and say hello in the live chat, and we will begin to walk around the National Cathedral grounds. All right, so Carolyn, why don't you go ahead and give us a little intro to what this place is.
Sure. So this is the Washington National Cathedral. It's the biggest church in Washington, D.C. It's one of the biggest churches in the world. They claim to be 6th largest in the world. And it's actually not a Catholic church, it's Episcopal. And its official name is the Cathedral Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. So it's called the National Cathedral, but of course we have our separation of church and state. So that word national doesn't mean that it has any connection to the government. It's just a place of national importance. It's held a lot of nationally important events. For example, presidential funerals, President Ford, President Reagan, most recently Senator John McCain had his funeral here. There's also many notable Americans buried here, like Woodrow Wilson, who's the only president buried in Washington, D.C., and then 2 other famous people, Helen Keller and her teacher Annie Sullivan, are also interred in the crypt at the National Cathedral. Now, the word cathedral comes from the Latin for chair, which is cathedra. So there is a literal chair in the cathedral, but it just means that this is the seat of the bishop. So this is the headquarters of the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. So that's where we get Washington National Cathedral.
That's rather interesting. So let's say good morning to everyone who is joining here. Simon, good morning. From Reading, pronounced Reading in the UK. I must have been mispronouncing that in the past. Apologize for that, Simon. And Gary tuned in from Oxford, Wisconsin. Good morning, Gary. Jason from Coventry, UK. Thanks for tuning in. I believe it is mid-afternoon in the UK right now. Although, did you guys switch to 5 hours ahead? Yesterday you were 4, I think today it might be 5. And Yoshi Elevators, good morning. It is a bit breezy today. Hopefully not too much wind gets picked up on the microphone. And Pat from Minnesota, good morning to you. So we'll go ahead and swing around to the side of the cathedral and head over to the gardens where there are a few good blooms. 4:03 p.m. right now in the UK. So you are back to 5 hours ahead in the UK. Brenton Ari from Toronto, good morning. And yes, Simon confirms you flipped 1 hour forward last night. So I'm glad you brought up the distinction of the National Cathedral. One thing that confuses people I know who come on my tours quite often is what the word national really means. And the honest truth is it really means much of nothing in many contexts.
They're always very specific that they have no connection to the government.
That's right. So I always say, you know, if you want to go to the National Aquarium, you would not come to Washington, D.C. You would go to Baltimore.
Though we did used to have a national aquarium, but it was kind of lame. It was in the basement of a government building.
We did used to have a sad National Aquarium branch in D.C. But the national many things can refer to something that is affiliated with the government, but it certainly does not have to.
This building in front of us is...
Carolyn?
Yeah.
You're from the Pie Nothing group.
Hi.
Carolyn has a friend who she's bumped into here.
Sorry.
PKLJLR77, tuning in from Liverpool. Good morning, or rather afternoon. They're in Liverpool. So what is this building that is right in front of us here?
This is the old baptistry. It's the oldest building on the cathedral grounds. The cathedral started in 1907 and finished in 1990. So it actually took 83 years to build, and this was built before the cathedral was finished to serve as the baptistry. When the actual baptistry was finished at the building proper at the cathedral, this was converted, and today it's a cafe. So if you ever come to DC and you want a really nice place for a coffee or for lunch in non-COVID times, this is a really nice spot.
Yes, they do have the branch of the Open City Cafe right inside. Brent Rolfe, thanks for the super chat, friend. Very much appreciated. So the weather today in Washington, D.C., not especially great. I forgot to check what the Capital Weather Gang and the Washington Post rated today before I left my home, but I'm sure it is not what they gave yesterday, which was a 9 out of 10.
It's okay, it just means the crowds are...
Yes, the good thing is that on a rainy day, it's not nearly as crowded. If you tuned into yesterday's live stream at the Washington Monument, you know that it was extremely busy down there. I am confident up here at the National Cathedral it will not be nearly so. Yoshi Elevators, yes, not as busy as yesterday, for sure. All right, so what is this arch we are about to walk under?
Yeah, so this is the entrance to the Bishop's Garden, which is one of the best spots on the cathedral grounds. The arch is actually taken from the ruins of a monastery, 14th century monastery in Europe. There's a lot of artifacts in the gardens that are taken from various ruins in Europe. Originally, this was just, as the name implies, the garden of the bishop, but today, and since the 1930s, it's been open to the public. So it's really, really gorgeous spot to stroll. So let's
head in. Now I have to be extremely careful because I'm holding the camera, I'm watching the comments, and doing all the things. And the stone here is a bit uneven, and as you can see, Carolyn has a foot injury as well, so
the blind leading the blind.
We're going to make sure that we don't have any injuries while we're here in the garden.
So we'll see a lot of cherry blossoms in the garden. We'll show you our favorite a little bit later, but here's a lovely one that's kind of in between two stages. I'm not sure if Rob talked about this before, but there are 6 stages of cherry blossoms. So the first one is green bud, then visible floret, then extension of floret, then my personal favorite, peduncle elongation, then puffy white, and then bloom. So if we look kind of close at this one is in extension of floret. This one is starting to bloom, and you can see this is called the peduncle. That's the part that's extended. And then like here, we've got still in the green bud phase. So this tree is all over the place. And there's lots of different kinds of cherry blossom trees. We'll show you the weeping cherry, which is my personal favorite, a little bit further down into the garden.
Yeah, I like the weeping as well because it's somewhat rare. The Yoshino is, I don't know the exact number. It's more than half, I believe, of all the
there's over
cherry blossoms.
On there, just on the Tidal Basin.
Yeah, so most of the cherry trees in Washington, D.C. are the Yoshino variety, which are the white ones, many of which we saw yesterday at the Washington Monument, but there are about a dozen varieties, and the weeping is cool looking, and it's fairly rare, so when you find one, you've got to stop and take advantage of that. Karen McGinn tuned in from Glen Ridge, New Jersey.
Hey, what's up, Jersey? I'm from Parsippany.
We have New Jersen on the live stream today. So if anyone else is from New Jersey, give a shout. And if you haven't already, if you tuned in after we got started, make sure to say hello, where you're tuned in the world, and out of curiosity, what the weather is like where you live, because today's weather in Washington, D.C., a bit wet. Fortunately, not pouring rain right now, but I probably just jinxed it, and hopefully we'll not have to get too wet over the next hour. Yoshi Elevators tuned in from Massachusetts. Good to see you, Yoshi. Yoshi won a Trip Hacks DC t-shirt on the Yellow Productions live stream a few months back. So if you haven't already, check out Yellow Productions, which I was fortunate enough to be a guest on a few months ago.
So there's a lot of good blooms in this upper garden here. Oftentimes, I think when people are looking at cherry blossoms, they expect to see this wild pink color, but most of the cherry blossom varieties actually are a lot more white than they are pink. So when you go down to the Tidal Basin, it's mostly this color. This is probably a Yoshino, which is the kind that Rob was just talking about. There's also sakuras, which are a little bit more pink, and then we'll show you those weeping cherries. And a lot of the plants in this garden are actually taken from Israel and Palestine and the Middle East. So these big trees here on the left, these are called blue Atlas cedars. They're over 100 years old, and they were taken from saplings from Israel, from Palestine in the early 1900s.
So, of course, we're at the National Cathedral, which is a religious place, so it's not surprising to hear that these plants came from places of religious importance. Karen McGinn says, Parsippany, yay!
Woo!
Not sure where Parsippany is,
Don't
but
worry about it, Rob.
I trust that anyone who knows about New Jersey does. And Fountain Pen Teacher from Western Pennsylvania. Rainy in the 50s over there today. And gray and overcast in Liverpool, even though it is British summertime, BST. And Gary Sorensen, thank you for the super chat, my friend. I do hope that you get a chance to come on a real-life tour someday. And in the description of this video, I already put a link to the DC Design Tours Cleveland Park tour. It's a limited time, so if you live in DC, you might be able to check that out. Andrew McKenzie, tuned in from DuPont Circle. Welcome, Andrew. And Tim from North Carolina, sunny and warm, which I wish it was right here. Dale, tuned in from cold and gray Chicago. Good morning, Dale. All right, so what is this gazebo-type building that is immediately in front of us here?
This is called the Shadow House. So it's just a part of the garden, but it was actually built from materials from the demolished home of Grover Cleveland. So Rob mentioned before the name of this neighborhood is Cleveland Park.
Cleveland Park.
And Grover Cleveland was one of the early residents. He had a big summer house up in what at that time was kind of the country highlands of Washington, D.C., and the house was called Red Top, and unfortunately it was demolished in 1927, but they took the pieces and they used the stone and the bricks. Maybe we could take a peek inside.
Yeah, let's go inside. It looks like it's calling us in.
They used all the materials to build this gazebo.
So what happens in here typically? Or is it just for hanging around?
It's just for hanging around. Actually, you'll often see, graduation photos, wedding photos. But if we go inside, this was all laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., who is the father-son team, one of the most famous landscape architects in the world. And this was specifically organized to frame particular views in these 8 archways out either towards the gardens or back toward the National Cathedral. So it's very intentional. I also love the brick pattern on the ground, which is also taken again from Grover Cleveland's house.
Grover Cleveland was former president. I don't remember which number. Sorry, numbers.
Yeah, he's the only president in American history to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So he ran once, then he lost the second election, which is actually why he moved out of his house. He was angry, so he went back up to New York. His house was demolished. But then he came back and ran in 1892 and won. At that point, his house had been sold off to somebody else, so he couldn't live here anymore. But he was apparently a little bitter, so he lived here, left, and then came back.
So not many presidents live in D.C. before they become president. It was probably more common during a certain era, when you might have served as, say, a senator or Congress member, and you would have lived in D.C. for your service. But nowadays, many of the presidents don't come from those backgrounds, or they don't live in D.C.
Big exception, the Obamas have a house, which I'm sure Rob has talked about before, in Calorama.
They currently do still live in D.C. Iqbal tuned in from Bali, Indonesia. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but thank you for tuning in. And what time of day is it in Bali? I am curious to know. And good question from PKJLR77. Are you able to go inside the cathedral on the tour? And I believe the answer to that is no.
Yes, at the moment the answer is no, because the cathedral is closed because of COVID, but generally they are open and it is very much worth your time. They do whole entire tours of the interior. You can go to a service here. They have concerts, and a lot of their events are non-religious, so they kind of serve as not just a religious institution, but also sort of a community center. I happen to live in this neighborhood a few blocks north, and I've been to lots of events at the cathedral, secular events. It's an awesome resource for the neighborhood and for the nation. You probably noticed the cathedral's having some trouble. Do you want to talk about the scaffolding, or should we wait till we get up close?
I will let you talk about the scaffolding when we get closer,
Okay.
But Dale does have a question about whether there are Palm Sunday services right now.
Not now. Normally, yes, but there's no services at all going on in person at the cathedral, but they're holding lots of virtual events. If you follow them on Facebook, you'll see they broadcast all of their services.
Yes, so Dale, I had the exact same question when I walked up this morning, and I said, it's Sunday morning, shouldn't there be church happening? And I, for a very brief moment, completely forgot that no, church is not happening because of COVID. So at some point, and hopefully the near future, if you roll up on a Sunday morning, you will see church, but no services today.
I've heard rumblings that they might be opening partially in May. So it's just a theory right now, but hopefully by summertime maybe they'll be open for everybody.
Yeah, so most likely what will happen is a partial opening. So however much the capacity is, they'll do a percentage of that, and then they'll increase it over time, and then eventually they'll get back to a full capacity. PKLJLR says, fantastic building, very impressive. And Ken and Cindy from East Texas. Thank you for tuning in this morning.
So one of the best things that happens in early spring in DC is the magnolias. Before we get cherry blossom blooms, and I know Rob was down at the Smithsonian Castle yesterday where there's really great magnolias, we get the magnolia bloom. They're the very first to pop. So this one in front of us, it's kind of at the tail end, but this is a star magnolia. If we get into the neighborhood, we'll see there's tulip magnolias, there's Jane magnolias. They're just as beautiful as the cherry blossom trees.
Yeah, so I have not posted the footage I got from the Smithsonian Castle yet. No, it's okay. People will like to know what's coming. But at the Smithsonian Castle, it is mostly, I believe, the saucer magnolia with some of the tulip magnolia mixed in. So just like the cherry blossoms, there is a variety. Now, don't mix up a magnolia and a cherry blossom. They are different flowers. I think the biggest difference between the two is that the magnolia has distinct petals, so you can see individual petals more easily, whereas the cherry blossom, the flower is more compact, and so it kind of looks like one unit, for lack of better words. And we have a good question. PKJLR, coming in with all the good questions today, asks, silly question, but why is the cathedral located not in the center of the city?
That's a great question. So there actually was a proposal for a national cathedral in the original plans of Washington, D.C. You guys might know some history about Pierre L'Enfant, who was the Frenchman who was hired by George Washington to lay out the plans of the city. He actually allocated a spot for a national church in downtown, just like your question. It was meant to be where the National Portrait Gallery is today. But as our early country was sort of working out our separation of church and state, it was decided not to prioritize a national church and instead to focus on the White House and the Capitol and the infrastructure of the city. So it wasn't until the early 1900s, 1907, that we got started on this national cathedral. And they picked this spot because this is one of the highest points in the city. On a clear day, we could actually go up little ways on the other side of the grounds and get a view down at the Washington Monument. You can see the dome of the Capitol. This is called Mount St. Albans. So it was all countryside when they started construction, or it was sort of transitioning in the early 1900s, but it's one of the highest elevations in the city, which is why they chose it.
Yes, but today is not a clear day, unfortunately. It's a very foggy day, so unlikely that we will be able to get those
we won't get
views that you just described.
Just have to come in person.
Hawkeye Stitcher tuned in from Anamosa, Iowa, where it is sunny and warm. And of course, thank you for tuning in, Hawkeye Stitcher. And Fountain Pen Teacher confirms that magnolias are much larger flowers. And Rob H., my friend from the Navy Yard in DC. Glad you're able to tune in today, Rob. Yes, rain is holding off here for now. When I left my home, I had to use my umbrella. Fortunately, do not need the umbrella at the moment, but storms are in the forecast, so hopefully they will hold off long enough for us to complete our live stream. All right, where to next? The cool-looking weeping cherry tree right here?
Yeah, this is my favorite cherry blossom tree on the grounds, and it's also my favorite type of tree. Weeping cherries I find to be, the most dramatic, the way that they hang down. And like we talked about before, there's lots of different kinds of cherry blossom trees. This one was planted in the 1940s, and this is always the prime Instagram spot when things really start to pop like they are now. But on a better weather day, we'll see people taking pictures, trying to frame the cathedral in the blossoms. And DC really has a love affair with cherry blossom trees, which started back in 1912 when we planted the first ones around the Tidal Basin. They were originally a gift from Japan. A funny fact is that in 1911, they tried to send us some trees, but they were actually infested with a parasite, so we burned them all. And then in 1912, we planted a new crop, and those are the ones that we know from around the Tidal Basin.
Yes, we're very lucky that the leaders in Japan were generous enough to send us a second batch, because the first batch had to be destroyed when they arrived, diseased. They do put little cards onto the trees so that you can see exactly what type of tree it is. This one says Weeping Cherry, Princeton strain. Just goes to show that there are many different varieties. And down in the description of this video, I put a link to a map of every cherry tree in Washington, D.C. So if you open up that map, if you're on a computer, probably harder to do on a phone, but if you're on a computer and you open up that map, you should be able to see some of the cherry trees that we're looking at today, and you'll be able to see the exact variety that they are. All right, PKJLR says thank you for the answer, and thought that most cathedrals are in the center of the city or downtown in the USA. I don't know about other cities, but I think it is probably true that cathedrals in many US cities are in the downtown area, but not this one. And like Carolyn said at the beginning, this is an Episcopal church, so there are many different religions, of course, and this is not a Catholic church, even though they call their buildings cathedrals too. We have a basilica a few miles away, which is the Catholic equivalent of this building.
And it has a really long name.
The Basilica of the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception.
That's it.
Did I nail it?
I think so.
It does have a long name, and both buildings are quite impressive, and both buildings have cherry trees on their grounds because we love them in Washington, D.C.
You want to go out to the steps and then go up from there?
Yes, let's go that route. If we are quiet, we might be able to see this rabbit over here. It looks like it's scurrying behind the bushes. People love to spot wildlife on the live stream. We're still looking for the albino squirrel.
Oh, the white whale.
Haven't found it yet. There's a rabbit. There's two of them right there. If we're very quiet, maybe we won't spook them. Mick Brolax, Mike, tuned in from Baltimore, says that the trees are beautiful. Can't distinguish between the apple and the cherry.
That's fair. Apple blossoms and cherry blossoms look very similar.
And plum blossoms are extremely similar to cherry blossoms, and they bloom a few weeks earlier. So a lot of times when tourists come to Washington, D.C., they might spot a plum blossom and get very excited about the cherry blossom. Now, I usually don't break their heart and tell them. I usually let them have it. Simply Jocelyn, thank you for tuning in. Simply Jocelyn says, so beautiful. Thank you for showing us around. Yes. Thanks to Carolyn, too, for leading me around this area, as this is her neighborhood and not mine.
This is, these are called the Pilgrim Steps. These were also built in the early 1900s, and they're built of Aqua Creek sandstone, which is actually the same sandstone that the Capitol building and the White House are built of. And if you ever come to the National Cathedral in the spring, in normal times, they have a huge event, which is the Flower Market. It is the big event of the year. It's used as a fundraiser for an organization called the All Hallows Guild, which is responsible for maintaining the grounds. And this was the original site of the Flower Market. You can find old photos and people in 1940s dress with big stands up and down the steps, but today the event is so big that it encompasses the whole grounds of the cathedral. So if you're ever here in springtime, not only will you get to see blooming cherry blossoms if you come to the cathedral, but you might also get to buy some.
Now, a question that people ask me all the time, especially at the Lincoln Memorial, is how could they build these stairs without a handrail? Now, this handrail does not look original to the stairs, so my guess is that at some point, for accessibility reasons, someone said, hey, we should really put in the handrail and make these stairs accessible. So
I'm personally very happy for the handrail since I broke my toe.
Yes, a tour guide with a broken toe, that is quite the unfortunate injury.
It's like a pianist with broken fingers.
Simon says the Easter Bunny is laying eggs for next weekend. I believe Easter is next Sunday, so that makes perfect sense to me. And Simply Jocelyn reminding everyone to give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying it. And thank you, Jocelyn, for that reminder. Tammy tuned in from New Hampshire. Are the museums open in DC and other places generally? The Smithsonian museums are not open. Most indoor sites are not open, but there are some private paid museums that have reopened. So you pretty much have to have a ticket anywhere you go. So the Spy Museum, for example, you can go, but tickets are required. And highly, highly, highly recommend you purchase those in advance because they are selling out from what I have heard. And Mick Brolax says, absolutely beautiful, and has given this video 4 thumbs up, so thank you for that. And Simon says that he has been to DC many times, but has never visited the National Cathedral, and will have to fix that on the next visit. I completely agree with you, Simon. All right, where to next, Carolyn?
Let's get a little closer to the building.
All right, sounds good.
Interesting artifacts.
But we should cover the elephant in the room here, the scaffolding, yes. Which is all up around here.
Yes.
And this is this goes back 10 years at this point, if my math is correct.
2011.
2011.
Yep, yeah, 10th anniversary of our 5.8 magnitude earthquake. So these are the remains of the scaffolding that still needs to be addressed, the damage that still needs to be addressed. I'm sure for you folks from the West Coast, from other parts of the world, you might be used to earthquakes, but it's pretty weird for the East Coast, and our buildings are just not built to sustain that kind of moving and shaking. So in the summer of 2011, we had this surprise earthquake, and the cathedral sustained many, many millions of dollars of damage. They've been fundraising to fix it ever since. They've fixed up the interior and most of the exterior, but this section of the building, because it's the heaviest and the tallest, it sustained the most damage. So you can see there's still scaffolding up. They've actually, if we go look over here, removed pieces of the building to stabilize it, and they're just sitting here on the ground waiting for enough funding in order to do a full restoration. They were doing it sort of piecemeal. Now they're just waiting to raise all the money that they need to address the last part of their repair efforts. But what's cool for us is that we get to see parts of the building that otherwise would be way, way up at the top that we never get to see. So for example, these faces here are meant to depict various prophets. Now they actually, when this was sculpted in the 50s, they didn't document who was who. So we don't know what prophet is what, but there's a theory that they were actually modeled after the sculptors that made them, which wouldn't be surprising, you know, thinking of the egos of artists, but they're pretty cool to see up close. And if we pan up, you can see where some of the damage took place. The pointy parts are called pinnacles, and you can see right above us where a big pinnacle is missing, and it's actually sitting right here in front of us on the ground. A lot of the pinnacles and sort of delicate parts of the cathedral crumbled and either fell onto the lower floors or fell all the way to the ground. One big chunk fell on the other side, kind of where we started, and apparently impaled itself into the ground upside down, and then someone stole it on the night of the earthquake. So there's a few pieces that they're actually going to have their stonemasons create again from scratch.
Someone stole it? Did they ever recover it, or is it it's gone for good?
It's gone for good. They must have had a truck, but I'm sure it was very heavy.
And someone clever snuck in and put a face mask on this guy over here, which I'm sure some people may have noticed.
I'm going to go grab my scooter.
I think it's interesting that the faces, you would think these are people from the Bible or religious figures, and it turns out maybe they're just the people who designed it. PKJLR loves the live stream, especially as can't travel at this time. I'm with you and glad that you're able to at least tag along for this. Wow, from McBrolex, of course. And Simply Jocelyn says, good preservation takes time. And Simply Jocelyn would know, as she is an expert in historic preservation. So take her word for it. Although coming up on 10 years, that is a long time. At least by my standards. All right, we have a question from PKJLR that you may have answered earlier, but I can't remember. What year did they start building the cathedral?
1907.
1907. And what year did they complete the cathedral? That's my question.
1990.
Yes.
So it took 83 years. Teddy Roosevelt laid the foundation stone on the eastern end, which you can go see, the eastern end. And President Bush did the final dedication in 1990. So 83 years to build the cathedral. I know that sounds like a long time, but it's a pretty impressive feat. This is a Gothic cathedral, high Gothic, and they built it using entirely traditional techniques. It's a fully stone building. So it takes a while, and it also took a lot of money. So it was a very slow process. They started on the eastern end, which is the oldest section of the church, and then they moved west, and they finished that western facade. And 1990, it opened to the public. So
I think yes, that sounds like a very long time, because when you're building, say, a skyscraper or something,
right,
it might take 5 years, and that seems like a long time, but that's actually a relatively short time. And if you think about other cathedrals in the world, say Notre Dame in Paris, I'm sure that was not built quickly either.
No,
I don't know the exact number of years.
Over and over again.
So if anyone in the live chat is from Paris or just happens to know a lot about cathedrals, let us know how long it took to build Notre Dame in Paris so we have a comparison. And yes, fountain pen teacher says European Gothic cathedrals took hundreds of years to build. That sounds correct to me. And Simply Jocelyn with the answer here, 83 years to build it. That is unheard of for Gothic. 10 years to fix is nothing. So another building that was damaged during the 2011 earthquake was the Washington Monument, and it was closed for, I believe, 3 or 4 years to do earthquake repairs, and people said that felt like it took forever. Like every time they came to Washington, D.C., the Washington Monument was closed. Now, we have a local rich guy, David Rubenstein, who paid for a lot of the Washington Monument earthquake damage and reconstruction. I do not believe he has paid for the work here. So they also have some fundraising challenges that the Washington Monument did not have.
Yeah, they have a giant Lego version of the National Cathedral that you can pay $1 to contribute a couple bricks to. So when the cathedral was open before COVID, that was one of their major fundraising efforts. I'm sure they'll continue to do that once everything reopens. I stopped here because I wanted to show you this amazing view. These are called flying buttresses. So these really, really tall pieces that are kind of extending out from the building. And this was one of the major innovations of Gothic architecture. We're talking way back, 12th century. Before Gothic, there was a style called Romanesque, which were much sort of lower buildings, flatter toward the ground, lower roofs, smaller windows. When they developed Gothic architecture now, because they could support the weight of the building from the outside using these sort of separate pedestals, they could build up. They could raise the ceilings, add big windows and stained glass, and that's how Gothic architecture sort of comes to be. So when you see a flying buttress like this, you know for sure, almost certainly, it's a Gothic building.
I like that term, flying buttress.
Me too.
All right. Simply Jocelyn says Notre Dame took almost 200 years, 1160-something to 1300-something. Don't remember the exact dates. Thank you. I know Simply Jocelyn goes to Paris quite often, or at least did before in the before times.
Jealous.
And Mitzi Mins says we'll be in D.C. next week. Hopefully there will be some things for you to see and the weather will cooperate. And Jason Stewart says the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona was started in the 1880s, but won't be finished until 2026.
So they say.
And yes, I am also distrusting of projected opening dates. As I was saying yesterday, don't trust any of the Metro to Dulles, because we've been burned many times.
That's so cute.
And let's say PKJLR, my local cathedral, in your case, if you wondered, I figured it was. So here we're coming up on, I believe, another set of magnolias.
Yeah, this is a star magnolia too.
So one thing I want to just note while we're here is what happens to the blossoms in the weather, because it's possible we might hit a peak bloom on the cherry blossoms this week, possibly even in the next couple of days. And people want to know, are they still going to be around next weekend? And it depends heavily on what happens weather-wise between the peak bloom and next weekend. It's a rainy day, and you can see that the rain has already started to knock the flowers off the tree and onto the ground. And as I was walking over to the cathedral from the Metro earlier, I spotted a very early blooming cherry tree where that was the case as well. It had already lost a lot of its petals from this morning's rain. So if we're lucky, there won't be any rain or wind this week, but this is Washington, D.C., so to expect good weather is not very realistic.
So now we're on the east side of the cathedral. So this is the oldest section of the building. This was the part that was finished first. So at the very bottom, you can see there's a bunch of stained glass there. That's the Bethlehem Chapel, which is the oldest section. That's been holding a service every day, except during COVID, since 1911. And just on the other side of it is the crypt, which is one of the neatest parts of the cathedral. If you ever come to the area and you take a tour with me, or you take a tour of the cathedral in general, they will usually take you down to the crypt, and it's really, really fascinating. That's where I mentioned before Helen Keller and Amy Sullivan are buried. Now, one funny feature of this side of the cathedral, if you look up above, you can see there's 3 figures carved into the rock there. Those are 3 of the apostles, Peter, Paul, and John, I think. But if you look really closely, maybe we can't see it on the small screen, there are birds' nests built on their heads. And apparently some birds have taken up residence here for the past few years, and the cathedral hasn't bothered to remove them, so they're having a good time living on top of the heads of the apostles.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't have good eyesight, so I can barely see the bird's nest. So I don't think that people can probably see it on screen, but you'll have to take Carolyn's word for it. Walter's World, thank you for tuning in. It's good to see you. And yes, the rain really messes with the flowers. Dale Jennings has been to Liverpool 7 times and loves the contrast between the two cathedrals. And Walter's World says that he remembers coming here on his 8th grade trip only a few years ago. So yes, of course, Mark Walters is only, I believe, 23 years old, so it would have only been a few years ago. And we have a question. Where is the Darth Vader gargoyle from Bat Dog?
I knew that was coming. So the Darth Vader gargoyle, you can't see it from the ground, and definitely not with a small screen, but it's on the northern side of the cathedral, so around that side there, way, way up at the top on one of the towers. It's much better to Google and look at a picture on your phone or on the computer, because you really can't see it from the ground. But there is a Darth Vader. It was a product of a design contest to design a number of the gargoyles. There's hundreds of gargoyles on the cathedral, and the contest was won by, surprise, surprise, a teenager who really liked Star Wars. So there is a Darth Vader way at the top staring down onto the people standing on the north side of the cathedral.
Okay, so this is an actual Star Wars thing. This is not just a quirky coincidence.
Oh yeah, it doesn't just look like Darth Vader. It is Darth Vader.
Good to know, and I did not know that, so thank you for enlightening me as well.
You always see people standing on the north side, gazing up, trying to peek at it, but it's really hard to see with the naked eye. Bring binoculars, or better yet, just look at a picture online.
And this is a good example of why virtual tourism does not work. We can do these every weekend, but for pretty much all of these sites, the monuments, the cathedrals, you have to see them in person. You just can't see them on a screen. It just does not do it justice. So
it's just a taste, a preview of what's to come when you come to visit in person.
In the after times, make sure to sign up for a real tour and see these places for real. And it sounds like that they can make out a wee bit the bird's nest, so that is good to know.
All right, do we have time to go into the neighborhood?
Yes, let's go ahead and continue on our tour. Good chatter here about all of the various cathedrals around the world. I have to admit, I am not a cathedral expert, but it sounds like we have a lot of cathedral fans in the audience today. And Simon says the Darth Vader gargoyle is definitely going to be a quiz question on one of his pub quizzes. Do you do a weekly pub quiz, Simon? I have done a few in the UK. They are quite fun. I dare even say better than the ones in DC. And Walter's World says, agreed, looking at it on screen is cool, but nowhere near as cool as the real thing. Can't disagree with that assessment. And yes, PKJLR makes a good point. You don't have to be religious to appreciate the cathedrals. You don't have to belong to the religion of the cathedral or any religion at all to appreciate the architecture and the beauty of these buildings. And yes, Simon does host a weekly pub quiz. Even hosted a fundraising pub quiz at the Dubliner by Union Station 4 years ago, one of our premier Irish pubs in Washington, D.C. We really only have a small number of Irish pubs, so when I say the premier, it doesn't have a ton of competition.
So we won't be able to see Darth Vader from here, but we look up at the towers, the far tower, the two front towers, the far one from us, way at the top there, that's where Darth Vader is.
Okay, so if I am pointing correctly, Darth Vader is here.
Yep.
Okay, we're definitely not going to be able to see it from way back here, but when you come to Washington, D.C., you will at least know where to look. All right, let's go on into the neighborhood.
All right.
And Walter's World, reminding everyone to please give this video a thumbs up if you are having fun. That would be much appreciated. Thumbs up so that I know that you are having a fun time this morning.
If you want to see more pictures of the cathedral and more stuff about the cathedral, feel free to follow DC Design Tours on Instagram. We are always here posting pictures. I'm doing tours of the cherry blossoms even with all my hardware. And you can check out more about the tours on our website, which is dcdesigntours.com. And thanks as always to Rob for hosting us on his channel.
Yes, I put a link in the description of the video already to the DC Design Tours website. And I follow on social media because I like to see the parts of town that I don't spend a lot of time in, like this one. All right, and PKJLR put in a plug for George Washington's birthplace, which I believe you're referring to Mount Vernon. I know that in a video I made with Walter's World a few years ago, that was mentioned.
So a lot of the buildings around the cathedral, like this one on the left, is part of their schools. They have 3 schools that are associated with them. This one is the Washington National Cathedral School. They also have St. Albans. So a lot of these beautiful, stately buildings are part of the cathedral grounds. But we're going to head into the neighborhood proper. Cleveland Park actually has the highest concentration of cherry blossoms off of the National Mall. If you look at that Casey Trees map that Rob mentioned, you'll see the pinkest part of town is Cleveland Park.
Yes, one thing that's fascinating to me about the map, which is in the description if you want to open it up and take a look, is that the cherry trees are all over the city. They are not just on the Tidal Basin. Now, granted, there are a lot of them over at the Tidal Basin, but if you tuned in yesterday, you know that it was absolutely mobbed with people down there. And if you want a much quieter cherry blossom experience, you got to get into the neighborhoods instead. And PKJLR says, what a lovely neighborhood.
Yeah, these the houses that we'll start to see here mostly were built between 1894 and about 1930. This was one of Washington, D.C.'s earliest streetcar suburbs. So on either side of Cleveland Park, there's 2 kind of main drags. There's Wisconsin Avenue, which goes down to Georgetown on the west side. And then there's Connecticut Avenue on the east side, which actually goes straight to the White House. And the streetcar were extended north at the end of the 1800s in 1892 and 1897. And that opened up a whole universe of development opportunity. So that's when most of these homes were built as part of the Cleveland Park Development Company, again, between around 1894 and 1927.
And I'm curious, if you are watching and you have been to Washington, D.C. on a trip before, have you been to this neighborhood? I suspect some people will have been to the Cleveland Park Metro, because if you have watched some of the Trip Hacks DC content about the zoo, you might remember that typically recommend you use the Cleveland Park Metro for going to the zoo so that you can walk downhill to get there.
Good hot tip.
This is, Washington, D.C. is a surprisingly hilly place, and the zoo, the National Zoo, is built on a giant hill. So if you've only visited the National Mall, you may think D.C. is flat, and you would be mistaken. All right, let's see. Walter's World looking at a fall trip to D.C. I hope that you are able to make that happen. It would be great to hang out again, and I think fall is probably the best bet at this point.
Also, I think the best time to come to D.C.
It's the best time of year. If people ask me what is my single favorite month, I say October.
Me too.
When I did a podcast with Jason Samanow, the editor of Capital Weather Gang, I asked him the same question. He said September. So I think either is good. But as far as weather-wise, and as far as less, lower crowds, September and October. September I like because it's typically a gap time period for field trips. You have kids starting back into school. They usually wait a few weeks into the school year before they do their trip.
So this house on the right, Rob, is one of my favorites in Cleveland Park. It's actually for sale, if anyone's interested.
Well, it's under contract according to the sign, and there's an estate sale, so...
I think it was for sale for $5.4 million, something like that. But this is a great example of Queen Anne style, which is one of the big styles in Cleveland Park. We'll see a lot of different styles if you walk around the neighborhood or you take a tour with me. But the big commonality with all of them are these giant wraparound porches, or big porches, and large windows. And that's because the way Cleveland Park was marketed was as an escape from the gritty heat of downtown Washington, D.C. So you'll always see big porches, big windows. My favorite quote about Cleveland Park in 1903, in the newspaper, the Washington Times, said it was the queen of the Washington suburbs. Looks like someone scored a rug.
Yes, it does look like the estate sale is going strong here. And let's see, Bat Dog lived in D.C. in the 90s, loved exploring the neighborhoods, but had trouble with peak bloom because the weather always took care of them before they got a chance to see them. Simon has been to the zoo and walked nearby to where we are now. And looking at a map, may have been here April in the past. And PK JLR compliments you on the scooter.
Thank you.
A good way to get around with a broken foot. Walter's World's going to shoot for October or September. Excellent. Good to hear that. Walter's World. And yes, this is the kind of neighborhood where if you want to walk around and look at houses that you can't afford and dream, you could definitely do it.
I lived in this neighborhood, but spoiler, I do not live in any of these houses.
Yeah, so
not on a tour guide salary.
Most neighborhoods have, especially the older ones, a combination of big apartment buildings where lots of us regular folks live, and then old houses where people either bought them a really long time ago when they were less expensive, or they have a lot of money and they wanted to live here, so they bought them now.
This stone wall on the right here, this is the only thing left from Grover Cleveland's house, which we talked about before, Red Top. It sat basically where this big house on the right that we'll see in a second was. The house was demolished. Some of it was used to build that gazebo that we talked about before, and this is the one piece that's left. The scooter might look cool, but not so good on the bricks.
Yeah, so it's hard to scoot on the brick sidewalks, which look very nice, but with all the tree roots and such that are underneath, can be difficult to navigate. And yes, PK JLR says it looks very expensive in this area.
Yes, definitely. You couldn't get a cardboard box for less than $1 million. And most of these homes are more like 3, 4, or 5 million.
So like I said, good for dreaming.
Good for looking.
And there is on local public TV, one of those house hunting shows, just for Washington, D.C. and the suburbs. I don't think you can get it in the rest of the country on TV, but you can probably get it online if you want to watch.
So across the way, there is one interesting artifact of the neighborhood. There's a sort of red pole across the intersection. Do you want to get close to it or just look at it from here?
Let's see it from here.
Okay, right over there. And these are called call boxes.
Actually, let's go up close. It's probably going to be too hard to see on the screen.
So these are one of the best sort of Easter eggs of Washington, D.C. There's over 400 of them in the city. And they were installed in this neighborhood in the 1890s, but in other places as early as the 1870s as a way to contact either the fire department or the police. So you could tell the difference between the poles because the fire department pole would have looked like this with the tall piece at the top painted red. And then the policeman pole would have not had the tall piece at the top and it would have been painted blue. So some of them are just kind of sitting and rusting. Eventually they were retrofitted with telephone, but there would have originally been a switch inside that you could flip, and it would send a telegraph signal either back to the fire department or the police. In this neighborhood, they've done a really nice job repurposing them, and they put historical plaques, sometimes it's the artwork, and you'll find these also in Georgetown and Embassy Row, all repurposed, and really fun Easter eggs. Also very, very appropriate for the time of year, but fun Easter eggs to find as you walk around the city. Okay,
so I'm curious, how did this work exactly? So it's filled in now with this plaque, but in the olden days, if there's a fire, in this building over here, I would have to come over here, and then would I talk into it? Would it be like a microphone, or would it be just a button you press and then the fire department arrives?
That's a good question. So there would have been a box. You would open the door and flip a switch, and it would send a telegraph signal back to the fire department. So, a light would blink basically where this call box was, and then they would know to report here. And then eventually it was retrofitted with telephones. So think of it like the college blue light system. You could actually pick up a phone and call back to the fire department. So they worked both of those ways depending on, what era we were in.
Okay, very interesting. And Rob has a good question. What decade or time frame did this neighborhood start to develop quickly?
Good question. So that's the streetcar suburb phase. Initially in the early mid-1700s, we're actually, if we have time, we'll go see one other spot, the earliest estate that's part of Cleveland Park. Originally this was just farmland, sort of agricultural plantations. It was in the 1890s when they extended those streetcar north on Wisconsin Avenue and Connecticut Avenue that the neighborhood started to explode. So starting around 1894 and then basically up to the Great Depression. That was the biggest phase of development. And then after, during World War II, there was also a big boom, but then they were building more like what Rob was talking about, big apartment buildings to accommodate the massive influx of government workers. And now there's actually a lot of new development going on. Just, you can kind of see at the end of the street there on Wisconsin Avenue, there's a huge development called City Ridge, which is where the old Fannie Mae headquarters would be. And they're going to add over 600 apartments, over 200,000 square feet of retail, a Wegmans, which all us locals are very excited about. So there is still development going on in the neighborhood. All
right, great. Hopefully that answers your question,
Good
Rob.
question.
And Walter's World says that this neighborhood's a wee bit out of his price range. PKJLR comments about the lovely sounds of the birds in the neighborhood.
Yeah, this is good. A good place for wildlife. Also a good place to see a lot of designer dogs.
I'm a fan of dogs, so, but we haven't seen too many yet. I guess people are waiting out the rain, perhaps. And question from Fountain Pen Teacher, is 800 Observatory Hill the same style? So
the Vice President's house?
Yes, can you clarify if you mean the Vice President's home, Fountain Pen Teacher, so that we can answer that question. Good to see you, Walter's World. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you can make it to DC this fall. And Stephen says, can I say Carolyn is awesome as I took the Georgetown tour with her?
Oh, cool. Hi, Stephen. Thank you.
Yes, Carolyn has a Georgetown tour, an Embassy Road tour, lots of tours that I do not have. So that is why we work well together. And PKJLR says, Carolyn is very interesting. All credit to her for doing this with an injured foot.
Thank you. The show must go on, right?
Yes, if you're a sports fan, you know that certain injuries are worse than others if you're a player. And for a tour guide, a foot injury is probably the worst that you could possibly have.
That or laryngitis.
Yes, if you lose your voice, that would be quite a bummer as well. And what did you think of the Georgetown tour, Stephen? I still have not gone on the DC Design Tour Georgetown tour myself. And yes, this is quite a good spot for hearing the birds chirping, if I may say.
All right. Well, this is a kind of a good place to wrap up. This big park, is it a good enough view, or should we go a little further?
Let's go a little bit farther down. I think the fence is
at the wrong height,
obstructing the view a little bit, but over here we should be able to see it better.
Yellow house, because that's what we're going to talk about.
The yellow house is this one here. And yes, Fountain Pen Teacher has clarified that they are referring to the Vice President's home. So what is the style of that home?
Good eye. That's also Queen Anne. It also has a lot of similarities to the house we were talking about before. It has a wraparound porch. It has a big tower on the corner with that conical roof, that sort of triangular shaped roof. And usually it's built with siding, which it has, wood siding. So yeah, that's also in the Queen Anne style. And it was also built at a similar time, around the turn of the century.
And they're renovating it right now. So the Vice President is either not fully moved in yet or still not moved in yet, and was living at the Blair House at the very beginning of the new term. Let's keep going.
There's not really a good view of that yellow house, which is probably how they like it.
Yeah, I think this is probably about as good as we're going to get it. Okay. It's very hard to see because it's obstructed by the hill and some trees and a very nice looking pink tree, but this is the house right over there in the back.
So this is the oldest building in Washington, D.C. This is part of what's now the Rosedale Conservancy, but originally this was the land, about 1,000 acres, of a guy named Uriah Forrest, who was the first resident of what becomes Cleveland Park. He was aide-de-camp to George Washington in the American Revolution, and he bought up this acreage in the 1700s because his wife didn't like living in Georgetown, which was, a gritty, smelly, congested area. So they had another house in Georgetown, which if you ever take my Georgetown tour, walk around Georgetown, is now the Ukrainian embassy. So this was their summer house. They had 1,000 acres, plantation, and some farmland. And that yellow house, which I know is a little bit hard to see, but that's where they lived. And there's an old stone house that was built on sort of on top of it. That's from the 1740s. So that's how they claim to be the oldest building in Washington, D.C. Today, it's all a park. There's 3 acres that are left of that original 1,000. Originally, after the Forrest family died out, this changed hands a number of times. It was actually owned by the National Cathedral. They had a boarding school here. And then eventually, in the 1990s, it was almost sold to the Bulgarian Socialist Nation to be turned into an embassy. And at that point, the neighborhood banded together, raised many millions of dollars using over 100 family donations, and they were able to buy up this remaining 3 acres. They converted the farmhouse back to a residence, which is what it is now, which is why we can't get very close to it. And now this is all parkland. It's technically privately owned, but it's usually open to the public.
Yeah, it's hard to appreciate because when people think of Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, they think of the entire District of Columbia as the city.
Right.
And then Maryland and Virginia, that's the suburbs. But for the first half of, the country's history, this was farmland. Outside of downtown, you were basically out in the country, even if you are only 4 miles away. So it's interesting to remember that the city has not always looked the way that it does. And Stephen says, great views of history and architecture on the Georgetown tour. It was his first time visiting that part of D.C. Amazing how much has changed along the Potomac and Canal in Georgetown.
Definitely.
And Fountain Pen Teacher confirms that the VP has not moved into the Vice President's home yet, the Naval Observatory home. It is under construction, renovation, and such. But I'm going to say that it is starting to rain. Not sure if you can see the drops in the camera, but it is starting to rain. So this is a good time to wrap it up. And so thanks for tuning in. If you tuned in today, make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel. There are going to be more special spring live streams next weekend. I haven't decided exactly what times yet, so I'll probably make that announcement on Thursday or Friday. A lot of it depends on the cherry blossom bloom and also some other factors, weather, of course. And so make sure you're following TripHexDC on social media so that you can keep up with that. And yes, Rob says we can see the drops, so that means it is a good time to say goodbye. PKJLR says great video. Thanks so much. And Rob is subscribed for the great content. And Carolyn, thank you again for
My pleasure.
leading me around the neighborhood. And make sure to check out the video description for the link to the Cleveland Park tour, which is running for a limited time only, including this weekend and next weekend, and probably depends on the bloom after that.
Yep.
But thanks again, and see you next time. And as always, I will say, enjoy your trip.